India and Pakistan say they've worked out a ceasefire deal, but still accusing each other of infractions overnight. Our Sri Jegarajah is here and keeping track of all of the latest developments. Sri, walk us through it.
Of course, Dan, President Trump calling it a ceasefire. India and Pakistan, interestingly enough, are not using that term to describe it. They call it a quote-unquote understanding. And nonetheless, if you take a look at how benchmark Indian stock markets responded, they gapped higher by well over 2% at the open. So they clearly and unequivocally see this as a ceasefire. That being said, from the perspective on the ground, there is arguably a lot of work to be done to ensure a stabilisation and an end to hostilities. India, by any stretch of the imagination, has not officially called off Operation Sindoor. So next will be a second round of scheduled talks between the Director Generals of Military Operations, the DGMOs, of India and Pakistan tomorrow on Tuesday. Indian markets quite clearly also responding to this momentum that we are seeing in terms of the entire tariff narrative and this narrative of substantial progress in Geneva vis-à-vis the US and China trade negotiations. So that's a good setup in terms of a potential deal that's waiting in the wings for India between the US and India and a bilateral trade deal. Dan, there's a lot of talk about a deal by Diwali, meaning a deal by mid to late October this year. And that perhaps explains why the US was so actively engaged in getting a ceasefire done between India and Pakistan. There is a lot at stake here. After some reported initial reluctance, the US moved quite fast in terms of corralling its other supporters and other allies in the region and in the Middle East as well, Dan. And it's interesting because there are multiple architects of this ceasefire, primarily the United States, Saudi Arabia and China, and that really is a roll call of the strategic and economic allies of India and Pakistan. So clearly there is no doubting what is going on here behind the scenes. There is a lot of economic self-interest at work here. Those countries, namely the United States, Saudi Arabia, China, do not want escalation between these two nuclear-armed powers, especially when regional security, macroeconomic stability, trade deals and, importantly, trade routes are at stake, Dan.
Sri, it seems like the United States has taken some credit here for negotiating this calming of tensions between the two sides here. And of course, as you correctly say, the GCC also actively involved, economic stakeholders also a part of that conversation. What is the risk of escalation now, though, and how confident are your sources that this truce, if you can call it that, will hold?
I think that's a very pertinent point, and I was speaking to my colleague, the correspondent in New Delhi, Parakshit Luthra, and he agreed with me when he said that the prospects for escalation and de-escalation are very, very finely balanced indeed. And already we are seeing developments in the immediate aftermath of this ceasefire being agreed in the last few hours, violations of the ceasefire. Explosions were reported within hours along the de facto India-Pakistan border. And I feel, and many experts agree with me, that part of the problem with the ceasefire was that it was cobbled together quite hastily, and that means that the conditionality is not clear. What exactly does de-escalation mean in principle, in practical, measurable terms, in KPIs? And of course, there is no neutral third party who can observe and help to implement this ceasefire and call out violations, because that's where the rubber really hits the road down in terms of sovereignty with regard to Pakistan and India, and they both feel very strongly about third-party mediation on the ground, whether it's the United Nations, whether it's an implementation force, or whether it's a peacekeeping force or a third party. So ultimately, there's a lot here that is open to interpretation and misinterpretation, and herein lies the risk, Dan.
Indeed. So what is the next flashpoint we should be looking out for, Sri?
Well, In terms of flashpoints, let's hope there aren't any further flashpoints, because the next set of discussions is going to be happening between the military. As I said, there will be a second round of scheduled talks between the DGMOs. This is the Director Generals of Military Operations of India and Pakistan on Tuesday, reportedly through a hotline. So this is important that both these sides and the militaries of both of these sides are communicating, are talking, are really hashing out the details of this quote-unquote understanding, and what many see as a ceasefire, what President Trump sees as a ceasefire, in order to prevent any further precipitation of violence.